Picture this. It's the 1970s. Bell bottoms are everywhere. Disco reigns supreme. And if you grew up in a working class home, your dinner plate was filled with budget friendly, no frills meals designed to stretch every dollar. Back then, certain foods were the ultimate markers of being broke. Ingredients that were dirt cheap, easy to bulk up, and definitely not considered gourmet. But fast forward a few decades, and guess what? Some of those so called poverty meals are now served in high end restaurants with fancy price tags. From spam sandwiches to offal meats and even instant ramen, dishes once eaten out of necessity have somehow become trendy, hipster approved delicacies. So, what exactly did people eat in the 70s when money was tight? And how did these humble meals go from being a source of embarrassment to a symbol of culinary nostalgia? Let's take a trip down memory lane, right to the dinner table of the past. Spam, the struggle staple turned trendy treat.
If you think Spam is just a simple sandwich meat, think again. This peculiar blend of pork shoulder and ham wasn't just a pantry item, it was practically a survival tool. If you grew up in a working-class home, that little rectangular can of mystery meat was an undeniable sign of tight finances. Spam had been around since the 1930s, feeding soldiers in World War II, before becoming a household staple across America. But by the 1970s, it wasn't just a cheap food, it was the cheap food. Families relied on it because it had a long shelf life, was incredibly versatile, and most importantly, didn't cost much. Fried Spam with eggs, Spam sandwiches, Spam casseroles. If it could fit between two slices of bread, it was dinner. But here's the thing. Back then, people weren't exactly proud of eating Spam. It was a sign that you couldn't afford steak, chicken, or even fresh ground beef. While middle-class families enjoyed roast dinners and frozen TV meals, Spam was for those stretching every last dollar. Fast forward to today, and Spam is having a surprising comeback. Hipster chefs and foodies are giving it a gourmet makeover, turning what was once a working-class necessity into a sought-after delicacy. But back in the 70s, if you were eating Spam, you weren't indulging. You were just trying to get by. Powdered milk, the breakfast struggle in a box. I found a recipe you won't find in a cookbook, but it's nutritious and a real money saver. Just take a quart of Carnation Instant non-fat dry milk. Picture this. It's the 1970s. You shuffle into the kitchen in the morning, bleary-eyed, only to be met with the inevitable. A dull, government-issued box of powdered milk. The ultimate sign that your family was struggling. For millions of Americans, especially those on government assistance, powdered milk wasn't a choice. It was the only option. It arrived in massive, industrial-sized bags, courtesy of government surplus programs. And if you ever had the pleasure of drinking it, you remember that unmistakable chalky texture and oddly artificial aftertaste. No matter how much you stirred, it never fully dissolved. Tiny clumps always floated stubbornly at the top. With inflation skyrocketing and grocery prices soaring in the 1970s, families on tight budgets had to make do with whatever they could afford. And for many, that meant enduring the questionable taste of reconstituted milk every single
Stretching
morning.
every dollar. The 1970s struggle meals. Budgets were tight, every penny had to count, and fresh milk? That was a luxury. Powdered milk was cheaper, lasted longer, and didn't require refrigeration. Perfect for households where wasting even a single drop wasn't an option. But let's be honest, nobody actually liked it. Kids dreaded it, parents tolerated it, and if company came over, you definitely weren't pouring them a glass. Some families even tried mixing it with real milk, hoping to mask the taste. Others just learned to endure it because, well, they had no choice. Fast forward to today, and while powdered milk still exists, it's mostly used for baking or emergency food storage. The stigma has faded, but for those who grew up with it in the 70s, the sight of that pale, watery liquid in a glass is an instant throwback to tougher times, one chalky sip at a time. Government cheese, the block of hard times. Up next, we have government cheese. Yes, that government cheese. The massive, waxy, bright orange block that became an unofficial symbol of struggle for low income American families. If you grew up eating it, you knew exactly what it meant. So, what was government cheese? In the 70s and 80s, America had a major dairy surplus. Farmers were producing way more milk than people could drink. Instead of letting it go to waste, the government bought up the excess, processed it into cheese, and distributed it through food assistance programs. But this wasn't your fancy cheddar from the grocery store. It came in a plain cardboard box with zero branding. It was dense, tough to slice, and melted in a way that could only be described as weird. Still, for millions of families, it was a lifeline. Stretching meals, making grilled cheese sandwiches, topping casseroles. The downside? If you had government cheese, everyone knew you were struggling. It wasn't just food, it was a label. Kids got teased and families felt the stigma of relying on handouts. But here's the twist. Some people actually miss it. That unique processed taste? Nostalgic. So while government cheese might have symbolized hard times, it also represented resilience, making the best of what you had. And let's be real. If you know, you know. Canned meat, the budget king. Next on the list, canned meat. Now, don't get it twisted. Canned meats weren't new. They had been feeding soldiers in wartime and stretching family grocery budgets for decades. But by the 1970s, if canned meat was a staple in your home, it usually meant one thing. Money was tight. Fresh meat? Too expensive. Frozen meat? Maybe, but not every home had a freezer. Canned meat, that was the budget king. You could fry it, slap it on white bread, or mix it into whatever leftovers you had. It wasn't gourmet, but it got the job done. The ads tried to make it look fancy, but let's be real. Kids at the lunch table knew the truth. If you pulled out a Spam sandwich, you might get some side-eye. It was the meal of the struggling, the paycheck-to-paycheck families trying to make ends meet. Funny thing is, canned meat is now making a comeback. Spam is a hit in high-end restaurants, and people pay good money for what was once considered a poor man's meal. Just goes to show, one man's struggle plate is another man's gourmet nostalgia. Hot dogs, the struggle meal in a bun-a, the humble hot dog. An American classic. Today, you'll find them at baseball games, backyard barbecues, and gourmet food trucks. But rewind to the 1970s, and hot dogs weren't some trendy street food. They were a dead giveaway that you were broke. Back in the 70s, if your family was eating hot dogs for dinner, it wasn't because you wanted to, it was because you had to. Hot dogs were cheap, filling, and easy to cook, making them a staple in low-income households. A pack of Franks cost next to nothing, and when money was tight, you could stretch them out with a loaf of white bread instead of actual buns. Pair them with canned beans or instant mac and cheese and boom. You had a meal that cost pennies, but screamed hard times. And let's talk quality. These weren't the all beef, preservative-free, artisanal sausages you see today. Nope, these were the lowest grade mystery meat Franks packed with fillers and nitrates, sitting in their own eerie juice inside vacuum-sealed plastic. You knew you were getting the bottom of the barrel when the first ingredient wasn't even beef or pork. It was just mechanically separated meat. Of course, not everyone eating hot dogs in the 70s was struggling. They were still a hit at cookouts and ball games. But if you were eating them on a random Tuesday night, boiled on the stovetop and served with government cheese, it probably wasn't by choice. So, while today's foodies may try to elevate the hot dog, for many who grew up in the 70s, it'll always be a reminder of survival, one bite at a time. Bologna sandwiches, the ultimate struggle meal. If you grew up in a working class home in the 70s, chances are you've had a Bologna sandwich, or 1,000. And let's be real, if your mom slapped a slice of fried bologna between two pieces of Wonder Bread, maybe with a little mayo if you were lucky, that was the universal sign that times were tough. Bologna sandwiches were the unofficial meal of being broke, and here's why. First off, bologna was cheap. You could grab a whole pack for next to nothing, and it lasted forever in the fridge. It was basically the hot dog's less respected cousin, processed, salty, and of questionable origin. But hey, it filled you up. And let's not forget the versatility. Some folks fried their bologna to give it that gourmet touch, while others just slapped it on cold with a slice of that government cheese. Either way, if you had one in your lunchbox, everyone knew your family was stretching every dollar. But here's the thing, bologna sandwiches weren't just food, they were a feeling. The feeling of sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that sad little sandwich while dreaming of a McDonald's cheeseburger. The feeling of watching wealthier kids at school time pull out Lunchables while you had yet another bologna and mustard special. Fast forward to today, and bologna sandwiches have an almost ironic, nostalgic charm. But back in the 70s, if that was on your plate, it meant one thing. You were eating on a budget, whether you liked it or not. Ramen noodles, from struggle meal to cult favorite. Today, ramen noodles have a cult following. Foodies are out here paying $15 a bowl for gourmet versions. But back in the 70s, ramen wasn't trendy. It was straight up survival food. If you had a pack of instant ramen in your cupboard, odds were you were scraping by. Instant ramen, from survival, food to culinary craze. The 1970s were anything but smooth sailing economically. Inflation was sky high, unemployment was climbing, and wages weren't keeping up. Enter instant ramen, a dirt cheap, calorie-packed meal that could feed you for literal pennies. Momofuku Ando, the genius behind Nissin, had introduced instant ramen in the 50s, but by the 70s it had become a lifeline for students, struggling workers, and anyone living paycheck to paycheck. Let's be real, it wasn't exactly nutritious. A pack of ramen was loaded with sodium, and the seasoning packet? Pure MSG magic. But when you're broke, you're not worrying about your salt intake, you're just trying to eat. What's wild is how ramen went from a you're broke meal to a full-blown foodie obsession. Now, high-end chefs serve up gourmet versions with pork belly and soft-boiled eggs. But in the 1970s, if ramen was on your plate, it wasn't by choice. It was because your wallet made the decision for you. Beans and rice, the ultimate budget meal. Beans and rice sounds simple, right? But back in the 1970s, this humble dish wasn't just food. It was a social status. If you were eating beans and rice for dinner, it usually meant one thing: money was tight. Let's set the scene. Bell bottoms, disco, and economic struggles. Inflation was out of control, jobs were unstable, and for working class families, stretching every dollar wasn't an option. It was a survival skill. That's where beans and rice came in. Why this meal? First, it was dirt cheap. A big bag of dried beans cost next to nothing, and rice was even cheaper. No fridge, no problem. Soak the beans, throw them in a pot, and boom. Dinner for the whole family. But here's the catch. If you were eating this all the time, it wasn't by choice. Beans and rice weren't trendy like today. There were no Chipotle burrito bowls or viral foodie posts. It was just a filling meal when money was tight. Funny enough, what was once considered a poverty dish is now a staple in upscale restaurants. But back in the 70s, if someone asked, "What's for dinner?" and you answered beans and rice, they knew times were tough. What was once survival food is now a classic. But for those who lived through it, beans and rice tell a much bigger story. Cornbread and milk, the forgotten struggle meal. Ever heard of cornbread and milk as a meal? No, not a side dish, not a snack, a full-on meal. If you grew up in the South or in a working class home in the 1970s, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Cornbread and milk. Ever heard of cornbread and milk as a full meal? Not a side dish, not a snack, an actual meal. If you grew up in the South or a working class home in the 1970s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This wasn't some trendy, rustic farmhouse recipe. This was survival food. Plain and simple. Cornbread has deep roots in American history, especially in the South and Appalachia, where wheat flour was a luxury, but cornmeal was cheap and easy to find. Add whatever milk you had, fresh, buttermilk, or even watered down skim, and you had something that would fill you up, even if it wasn't exactly exciting. By the 1970s, cornbread and milk had become more than just a meal. It was a symbol that money was tight, that groceries were running low, and that you had to stretch what little you had. If you didn't even have cornbread, you'd crumble up saltine crackers into your milk instead. Same struggle, just a different texture. Fast forward to today and you'll see cornbread and milk on high-end menus, repackaged as a nostalgic comfort food. But for those who actually lived through it, there's no nostalgia, just memories of empty wallets and making do with what was available. Funny how something that once signified hardship is now considered gourmet. Canned vegetables. If you grew up in the 1970s, there's a good chance canned vegetables were a dinner table staple, whether you liked them or not. But what most people don't realize is that canned veggies weren't just a matter of convenience back then. They were often a sign that money was tight. See, fresh produce wasn't as widely available or affordable as it is today. Farmers' markets weren't trendy, they were rare. Supermarkets didn't have endless aisles of organic kale and microgreens. For many families, fresh vegetables just weren't in the budget. So they turned to the next best thing. Canned green beans, peas, corn, or, if you were really unlucky, mixed vegetables. Canned food was cheap, lasted forever, and could stretch a meal when money was tight. But it also carried a certain stigma. Fresh produce was for families with money, while canned food was for those just trying to get by. And let's be honest, canned veggies weren't exactly gourmet. They were mushy, salty, and often flavorless, making them an easy target for kids pushing them around their plates, hoping they wouldn't have to take another bite. Ironically, canned vegetables had once been marketed as a modern convenience, but by the 1970s, attitudes had shifted. Suddenly, what you ate wasn't just about nutrition, it was about status. Fast forward to today, and canned vegetables are making a quiet comeback, thanks to rising grocery prices and a wave of nostalgia. But back then, a plate of canned green beans could tell the whole neighborhood just how much your family was struggling, whether you wanted it to or not. Grits and oatmeal. Two breakfast staples that for many families weren't just a choice, they were a necessity. If you had a steaming bowl of one of these on your table back in the day, chances were your family wasn't exactly living large. Why did these meals become a symbol of hard times? Let's break it down. The 1970s were rough. High inflation, low wages, and a lot of families stretching every last dollar. That meant making meals that were cheap, filling, and could feed an entire household without breaking the bank. Enter grits and oatmeal. Grits made from ground corn were a southern staple. You could buy them in bulk for almost nothing. Add a little butter if you were lucky, and boom, breakfast was served. Oatmeal was the northern equivalent. Rolled oats were affordable, filling, and easy to make with just water and a pinch of sugar, if you could afford the extra sweetness. Now, don't get me wrong, Plenty of people still love grits and oatmeal today. But back then, if that's all you had, it was a clear sign that money was tight. No bacon, no eggs, no fancy cereals, just a bowl of mush. Kids dreaded it, adults tolerated it, and for many, it became a lasting reminder of financial struggle. Fast forward, and now chefs are putting gourmet twists on these struggle meals. But for those who grew up on them out of necessity, the memory of eating them day after day still lingers. So, what do you think? Are they still struggle meals, or have they earned their place as timeless classics? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Mac and cheese. Mac and cheese. It's the ultimate comfort food, right? But back in the 1970s, it wasn't the trendy Instagram-worthy dish you see today, loaded with lobster and truffle oil. Nope. It was the "we're broke and this is dinner" meal. Boxed mac and cheese, usually Kraft, was a lifesaver for families who needed something cheap, filling, and easy to make. A single box cost almost nothing, and all you had to do was boil some noodles, mix in that neon orange cheese powder, and dinner was served. No frills, no extras. Just a plate of creamy artificial cheese-coated carbs. For kids, it was a love-hate relationship. On one hand, mac and cheese tasted good. It was cheesy, warm, and comforting. But on the other hand, if you were eating it multiple times a week, you knew what that meant. Money was tight. No meat, no fancy sides, just mac and cheese, maybe with a few hot dog slices thrown in if your family was feeling fancy. Today, mac and cheese is having a moment. Restaurants are serving up gourmet versions with bacon, smoked Gouda, and even lobster. But for those who remember eating it as a necessity rather than a treat, it's hard to see it as anything but a reminder of tough times. So, is mac and cheese a timeless classic or a struggle meal in disguise? Let us know in the comments. Struggle meals of the 70s, from necessity to nostalgia. Mac and cheese, the budget lifesaver. Back in the 70s, mac and cheese wasn't the Instagram-worthy comfort food you see today, loaded with lobster and truffle oil. Nope, it was the ultimate "we're broke and this is dinner" meal. A box of Kraft, a little butter, and some milk, or just water if things were really tight. And boom, dinner was served. For working class families hit hard by inflation and economic downturns, mac and cheese was a staple. If you grew up eating it multiple times a week, you probably didn't think much of it, until you realized wealthier families were dining on steak and roast chicken while you were scraping the last neon orange bite off your plate. And let's talk about that cheese powder. Today, people love the nostalgia of that almost radioactive looking dust. But back then, it was a sign of making do. Real cheese was expensive, so processed cheese products, think Velveeta and Kraft singles, became household essentials. They lasted longer, cost less, and got the job done. Mac and cheese even made its way into government assistance programs, food pantries, and school lunches, cementing its status as poor people food. If your mom stocked up on the 5 for $1 sale, you knew times were tough. But here's the twist. What was once a last resort meal is now a beloved classic. Upscale restaurants serve gourmet versions, and people willingly pay $15 for what used to be a $1 dinner. Funny how things change, right? Fried bologna or spam with eggs. The breakfast of hard times. Ever had a meal that instantly brings back childhood memories, but not necessarily the ones you want to relive? Yeah, let's talk about fried bologna and spam with eggs. If this was a regular on your plate in the 70s, chances are your family wasn't exactly rolling in cash. Sure, fried bologna and spam had their moments. They weren't terrible if you ignored the weird rubbery texture and the fact that both smelled like regret when they hit the pan. But let's be real, Nobody was eating this because they had options. Bologna was basically the discount hot dog of lunch meats. And Spam? Well, Spam was whatever was left over after they ran out of hot dog parts. These weren't just foods, they were economic indicators. Walk into a kitchen back then and see that shiny, gelatinous hunk of Spam waiting to be sliced. You knew times were tough. Grocery stores sold Bologna by the stack for next to nothing, and a can of Spam could stretch a meal far. Parents threw it in with eggs, slapped it between Wonder Bread, or diced it into some questionable casserole. And guess what? Nobody was thrilled about it. Fast forward to today, and both of these struggle meals have had a bizarre cultural redemption arc. Chefs are putting gourmet fried bologna sandwiches on menus, and Spam is a delicacy in places like Hawaii. But for those who grew up in the 70s, it's hard to see past what it really was, a neon pink symbol of we can't afford bacon. Peanut butter and jelly. The school lunch hierarchy. Let's talk peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Today, they're a nostalgic comfort food. But back in the 70s, they weren't exactly a flex. PB&J was cheap, simple, and a telltale sign that money was tight. In an era when TV dinners, hamburger helper, and bologna sandwiches were common, PB&J was almost too basic. Peanut butter was government commodity item, meaning struggling families might have gotten it for free. Bread, cheap and filling. And the jelly? The cheapest kind came in glass jars that doubled as drinking cups when emptied. Put it all together and you had a meal that checked the affordable box but didn't scream luxury. Meanwhile, kids from wealthier families were munching on turkey sandwiches, ham and cheese, or even thermos-packed soups. Their lunches had name-brand chips, fruit cups, and the ultimate flex, a Capri Sun or a can of soda. If your lunchbox had peanut butter and jelly and a generic juice box, yeah, kids noticed. Fast forward a few decades and PB&J has had the ultimate glow-up. People embrace it for nostalgia, health benefits, and even gourmet versions, with fancy nut butters and organic jams. So next time you slap together a PB&J, just remember, what was once a sign of struggle is now an American classic. Funny how things change, right? Potatoes, the 70s survival superfood. Picture this, it's the 1970s, bell bottoms, disco, and potatoes? Yep, potatoes weren't just food back then. They were practically a class symbol. If your family was eating them night after night, chances were money was tight. In an era when TV dinners and fast food were on the rise, the humble potato remained the ultimate budget meal. Why? Because it was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. A sack of potatoes could keep a family fed for days. Fry them, mash them, bake them, it didn't matter. At the end of the day, it meant one thing. You couldn't afford steak. In the 70s, a pound of potatoes cost around 10 cents.
Compare that to a pound of beef, which could set you back nearly $1. For working-class families, especially those struggling through the oil crisis and rising inflation, potatoes weren't just a side dish, they were the meal. Meanwhile, middle-class families were embracing the convenience of canned soups, frozen dinners, and instant noodles. If you were still eating plain boiled potatoes, it wasn't because you loved them, it was because you had to. But here's the irony. Today, potatoes are back in the spotlight. High-end restaurants serve gourmet mashed potatoes with truffle oil, and foodies swear by authentic, twice-fried French fries. What was once a symbol of financial struggle is now a trendy comfort food. Funny how food can tell a story without saying a word. Every night it was a dead giveaway if your family wasn't exactly swimming in cash. Fast forward to today, and potatoes have made a stylish comeback. Fancy fries, gourmet mashed potatoes, and fully loaded baked potatoes now scream luxury. But back in the 70s, if your plate was mostly potatoes, well, let's just say times were rough. Ever heard stories about potato-heavy meals from your family? Drop a comment below. Homemade soup. Today, it's the ultimate cozy, rustic, Pinterest-worthy meal. But in the 1970s, if homemade soup was on the menu, it usually meant one thing: you were broke. The 70s were a strange time. Fast food was booming, TV dinners were the future, and packaged meals were a status symbol. Meanwhile, homemade soup was a sign that you were stretching every ingredient for as long as possible. Think about it. Soup is literally water with whatever scraps you have lying around. Leftover chicken bones? Toss them in. A single potato? Dice it up. That sad half carrot from last week? Perfect. Back then, if you had money, you were buying Swanson TV dinners, Spam, or the ultimate flex, Campbell's soup. Yes, even canned soup was fancier than homemade because it meant you could afford convenience. If mom was making soup from scratch, it was probably because buying fresh meat just wasn't an option. But here's the irony. What was once a sign of financial struggle is now a badge of health and nostalgia. Today, homemade soup is organic, artisanal, and somehow worth $12 a bowl. Funny how things change, huh? So next time you're simmering a pot of homemade soup, remember, 50 years ago, that might have meant payday was still too far away. Cabbage-based meals. If your family relied on cabbage back in the 70s, chances are money was tight. This humble leafy green wasn't just a side dish, it was a financial survival tool. But why was cabbage linked to being broke? And how did it go from poor people food to a superfood beloved by health-conscious foodies? Let's break it down. Cabbage was, and still is, one of the cheapest vegetables you can buy. In the 70s, with inflation high and wages stagnant, families needed to stretch their grocery budgets as far as possible. Enter cabbage, dirt cheap, filling, and incredibly versatile. You could boil it, fry it, stuff it, or eat it raw. Cabbage-heavy meals were a staple in low-income households. Cabbage soup, boiled cabbage with potatoes, or fried cabbage with cheap cuts of meat were survival staples. Ever heard of the cabbage soup diet? It wasn't just for weight loss. It was a real-life, budget-friendly necessity for struggling families. If you walked into a house that smelled like simmering cabbage, you knew they were making the best of a tight budget. Fast forward to today, and cabbage has had a glow-up. Once a symbol of financial hardship, it's now praised as a high-fiber, gut-friendly superfood. Chefs put fancy spins on cabbage dishes, and suddenly it's trendy again. So next time you dig into a bowl of cabbage stew, remember, it wasn't always cool. In the 1970s, it was survival food. Funny how things change, huh? Tuna casserole. Next on our list is the iconic tuna casserole. If you grew up in this era, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a bag of egg noodles. Mix it together, toss in some crushed potato chips if you're feeling fancy, and boom, dinner is served. Cheap, easy, and everywhere. But here's the thing. Tuna casserole wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. A statement that said, we don't have steak money, but we're going to make this work. If your mom pulled out a Pyrex dish full of that creamy, fishy concoction, you knew times were tough. And if you were eating it multiple times a week? Yeah, your family was struggling. The 70s were a weird food era. The post-war boom of the 50s and 60s introduced convenience meals, TV dinners, Jell-O salads, and yes, casseroles. But by the 70s, the economy had taken a downturn, and these meals weren't just about convenience anymore. They were about survival. And tuna casserole, that was the ultimate broke food icon. Filling, cheap, and made with non-perishable ingredients, perfect for stretching a grocery.
Food struggles of the 1970s. Now trendy? Back in the 70s, meals like tuna casserole, meatloaf, and sugar sandwiches weren't trendy. They were survival food. Tuna casserole was cheap, mushy, and everywhere. Meatloaf? Mostly filler, barely meat. And if you were down to sugar sandwiches or plain buttered bread, times were really tough. Fast forward to today, what was once poor people's food is now a gourmet trend. Ramen, meatloaf, even peanut butter on toast. Overpriced in hipster cafes. Funny how food trends change, huh? Did you or your family grow up eating these? drop a comment below.